Elias Ward's knife sliced through the first rope as the woman's body dropped toward the frozen ground. He caught her shoulders, feeling the faint flutter of pulse against his palm. Four more bodies swayed in the dawn wind, wooden signs burned into their chests. This ain't your land. His silver mare snorted, ears flat against the bitter cold that swept down from the northern ridges. Blood had pooled beneath the makeshift gallows, dark stains in the snow that led toward his inherited cabin. Uncle Jeremiah's final gift had come with a greeting party. The woman in his arms stirred, black hair falling across rope burns that circled her throat like a necklace. Her eyes opened, sharp green cutting through the haze of pain. She tried to speak but only managed a rasp that sounded like breaking glass. "Don't move," Elias said, lowering her gently to the ground. His boots crunched through ice as he moved to the second rope. Red-haired woman, younger, with fists still clenched even in unconsciousness. The blade sang through hemp fiber. One by one he cut them down. A blonde girl with gentle features. A dark-eyed woman whose stillness felt like coiled steel. An older woman whose weathered hands told stories of frontier survival. All breathing, all meant to be as warnings. The cabin door hung crooked on its hinges. Bullet holes peppered the wooden walls in neat rows. Someone had taken their time making a point. Elias dragged the first woman through the entrance, her body lighter than it should have been. Starvation had carved hollows in her cheeks. Inside smelled of dust and old gunpowder. A pot-bellied stove sat cold in the corner, kindling, scattered across the floor like pickup sticks. Elias struck a match, feeding flame to paper and wood until warmth began pushing back the mountain chill. The women needed heat more than they needed answers. He arranged them near the fire, checking pulses, counting breaths. The black-haired one's eyes tracked his movements with predator awareness. She'd been conscious longer than the others, playing dead while hanging from that rope. Smart. Survivors learned to wait for their moment. "Water," she whispered when he knelt beside her. Elias tipped his canteen to her lips, watching her throat work carefully around each swallow. The rope had left its mark, but hadn't crushed anything vital. Whoever strung them up wanted them found alive, wanted him to cut them down and involve himself in something that would get him killed. "Who did this?" he asked. She studied his face before answering. "Judge Morrison owns most everything between here and Denver. We tried to stop him selling women like cattle." Her voice scraped like sandpaper. "Now you're part of it, whether you want to be or not." The red-haired woman pushed herself upright, blue eyes blazing despite exhaustion. "Should have left us hanging. Morrison doesn't forgive, and he doesn't forget. You just painted a target on your back." "Target was already there." Elias added another log to the fire. "This land belonged to my uncle. Morrison must have figured I'd come for it eventually." The older woman spoke for the first time, voice steady as stone. "Your uncle fought Morrison for 2 years. Found evidence of his trafficking operation. Judge had him killed 3 months ago, made it look like a heart attack." Through the cracked window, Elias caught movement on the ridge. 3 riders in black coats, too far away to identify, but close enough to send a message. They'd been watching, waiting to see what he'd do with their handiwork. The blonde girl stirred, eyes fluttering open. She saw the others and immediately tried to sit up, panic written across her features, until the older woman placed a calming hand on her shoulder. "We're alive, Sadi. He cut us down." Sadi looked at Elias with something between gratitude and terror. "Morrison killed my father, said he stole horses, but Papa never took anything that wasn't his. I became collateral for a debt that never existed." The dark-eyed woman finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Violet. I have papers hidden in town. Contracts forged, deeds lists of bought judges. Morrison thought hanging us would bury the evidence." Elias checked his Winchester, counting rounds. 16 shots plus what he carried in his belt. Not enough if Morrison came with his usual crew, but enough to make a statement. The riders on the ridge hadn't moved closer, but they hadn't left either. "What's your name?" he asked the black-haired woman. "Clarabelle. And before you ask, yes, we knew this would happen. Morrison doesn't leave loose ends. We stayed anyway because someone had to bear witness." The cabin fell quiet except for crackling wood and shallow breathing. Outside, wind whistled through bullet holes carrying the scent of coming snow. Elias had served through 3 campaigns in the war, learned to read weather like a soldier reads battlefield smoke. "Storm coming tonight, big enough to trap them here." "There's food in the root cellar," he said. "Coffee beans, salt pork, dried beans. Enough for a week if we're careful." Ruby the redhead laughed without humor. Week you think Morrison will give us a week. He'll be back before sunset with enough men to burn this place to ash. Through the window the riders had multiplied. 6 now, then 8. Black shapes against white snow, patient as carrion birds. Elias recognized the formation from his military days. They were setting up a siege, cutting off escape routes while more men moved into position. The older woman, Grace, stood slowly testing her balance. Morrison expects us to run or surrender. He's never faced anyone who cut down his warnings and invited the fight. Clarabelle struggled to her feet, accepting Elias's steadying hand. You sure about this last chance to ride away and pretend you never saw us? Elias looked at each woman in turn, battle-worn faces that had seen too much suffering, eyes that held embers instead of hope. They'd been written off as dead, hung like scarecrows to frighten away anyone who might challenge Morrison's control. But they were still breathing, still fighting. He checked the loads in his spare revolvers, testing the action on each cylinder. I've been running from fights my whole life. Time to stand and see what happens. The riders on the ridge began moving down the slope. The riders spread out like spilled ink across the valley floor, Morrison's black coat unmistakable even at distance. Elias counted 15 men, maybe more, hidden into the tree line. They moved with military precision, cutting off every escape route while staying just out of rifle range. He's not attacking, Violet observed, peering through a gap in the shutters. Just watching. Clarabelle spat blood into the fire where it hissed against hot coals. Wants us to sweat first. Let fear do half the work before he sends in the wolves. Elias handed Ruby his spare Colt, checking that she knew how to work the action. Her fingers moved over the weapon with practiced ease, muscle memory from a life that had required such knowledge. Where'd you learn to shoot? Comanche took my family when I was 12. Spent 3 years with them before I escaped. They taught me things the white schools never would. She checked the cylinder, counting bullets. Morrison burned my new home thinking I'd forgotten how to fight back. Grace moved through the cabin with surprising steadiness, gathering supplies into defensible positions. Food here, ammunition, there, water within reach of the firing positions. Her movement spoke of experience, someone who'd survived frontier violence before. Sadi pressed herself against the far wall, clutching a small derringer Elias had found in his uncle's effects. I can't do this. I'm not a killer. Neither was I, Grace said quietly. Until Morrison's men came for my daughter. Sometimes the world doesn't give you a choice about who you become. Through the afternoon, the siege settled into waiting. Morrison's men built small fires, taking turns riding patrol loops around the cabin. No rush, no urgency. They had all the time in the world, while Elias and the women had limited supplies and no reinforcements coming. Violet produced a small leather portfolio from inside her dress pages, covered with careful handwriting. Jeremiah wasn't the only one keeping records. I documented every transaction, every forged paper, every woman who disappeared. Morrison thinks hanging us would bury this evidence. Won't matter if we're all dead, Ruby said, but she studied the papers intently. Names, dates, locations. A spider web of corruption stretching across 3 territories. As shadows lengthened, Elias noticed something. They're not covering the north side as heavy. Game trail runs through those rocks, comes up behind the woodshed. Clarabelle followed his gaze. You thinking of running? Thinking of evening, the odds. He pulled on his coat, checking his knife and spare ammunition. If I can get close enough to their camp, maybe thin out their numbers before full dark. That's suicide, Grace said flatly. Maybe, but sitting here waiting for them to burn us out isn't much better. Elias looked at each woman. Keep the fire going and make noise like you're all still here. I'll be back before moonrise. Ruby caught his arm. You don't owe us anything. Could still walk away from this. Could have walked away when I saw you hanging from those ropes. He checked his Winchester one final time. Didn't then, won't now. The game trail wound through granite outcroppings that provided cover from watching eyes. Elias moved like he'd learned during the war, patient steps that made no sound on stone and pine needles. The temperature had dropped with the sun breath misting in the thin mountain air. Morrison's camp sprawled across a meadow below the cabin, men clustered around 3 fires. Elias counted 17, now more than he'd estimated. They'd brought a small cannon, the kind used for clearing tree stumps. Serious hardware for a simple eviction. He worked closer, using shadows cast by firelight to mask his approach. Horses picketed on the far side, guards rotating every hour like clockwork. Professional operation, not just hired thugs. Morrison had brought veteran gun hands for this job. 2 sentries walked the perimeter, meeting at the horse line before turning back. Elias timed their patrol, noting the gap when both men faced away from his position. 30 seconds to cross open ground and reach the ammunition wagon. He moved during the next rotation, boots silent on frost-brittle grass. The wagon sat unguarded cases of rifle cartridges and powder kegs stacked carelessly in the bed. A single stick of dynamite tucked behind the wheel caught his attention. Voices approached. Told the judge we should have just burned them out from the start. Morrison wants them alive. Says the hanging was too quick, wants to make an example this time. Elias flattened himself beneath the wagon as boots passed inches from his face. The guards continued their patrol, voices fading toward the fire line. He reached for the dynamite, checking the fuse length. Short burn, maybe 2 minutes. A horse whinnied nearby, ears pricked toward his hiding spot. Elias froze as one of the animals sidled closer, curious about the strange scent. The mare stretched her neck, breath warm against his cheek. Easy girl. He stroked her nose, recognizing the branded mark on her shoulder. Army remount trained not to spook at gunfire. These weren't local hired guns. Morrison had brought cavalry veterans, men who'd learned killing as a profession. The dynamite fuse caught on his third match strike flame, eating toward the powder at a steady pace. Elias rolled from beneath the wagon, using the horses as cover, while he worked back toward the trail. Behind him, men laughed around their fires, unaware that death approached on a burning string. Halfway up the slope, the explosion lit the night like brief daylight. Horses screamed and bolted in every direction, while men shouted orders that no one could hear over ringing ears. The ammunition wagon burned in pieces, scattered cartridges cooking off like firecrackers. Elias reached the cabin as return fire began, muzzle flashes winking from the meadow like angry fireflies. Bullets whined overhead, most shooting high in the darkness. But some found their marks, splintering logs and shattering the remaining window glass. "Get down!" He dove through the door as a rifle ball punched through the spot where his head had been. Inside, the women crouched behind overturned furniture, weapons ready. "Thought you were dead," Clarabelle said, helping him drag a heavy chest against the door. "Not yet." Elias counted the muzzle flashes below. Still too many, but fewer than before. The explosion had scattered their horses, killed at least 3 men, and destroyed most of their spare ammunition. They'll come hard now. No more waiting. Ruby peered through a gap in the shutters. They're forming up for a charge. Through the bullet holes in the walls, torchlight flickered as Morrison's remaining men advanced up the slope. Their voices carried on the night wind, ugly promises of what would happen when they breached the cabin walls. Grace chambered around in her old musket. "Let them come. We'll be ready." The first wave came screaming up the hill like demons freed from hell. Muzzle flashes lit their faces, twisted masks of violence and greed. Elias met them at the shattered window, Winchester bucking against his shoulder as he worked the lever action with machine precision. Ruby's Colt barked twice, dropping a man who'd reached the porch steps. She rolled to a new position, dress torn, but movements fluid as a dancer. Left side, 3 more coming through the trees. Violet crouched behind the overturned table, her small derringer steady in both hands. When a raider kicked through the door, she put 2 bullets, center mass, before he cleared the threshold. No hesitation, no mercy. The quiet woman had become something deadly. "Grace, behind you." Sadi's warning came just as a man swung through the back window. Grace spun her old musket, roaring like thunder. The intruder flew backward, disappearing into darkness. Clarabelle fought with knife and gun, moving through the cabin's confined space like she'd been born to violence. A raider grabbed her from behind, arm around her throat where the rope marks still showed. She drove her blade backward into his ribs, twisted, and let him fall. The assault broke against their defense, survivors stumbling back down the hill to regroup. Elias counted 4 bodies in and around the cabin, blood soaking into Jeremiah's wooden floors. They'd held but barely, and Morrison still had men to spare. "Reload, everyone. Check your ammunition." Elias's voice stayed calm despite the chaos. Military training taking over, turning fear into procedure. "They'll hit us harder next time." Through the smoke and cordite haze, a voice carried from the meadow below. Morrison himself no longer hiding behind his hired guns. "Ward, you killed good men tonight. Time to settle this face to face." Clarabelle spat blood, wiping her knife clean on a dead man's shirt. "He wants to parley. That means we hurt him worse than he's letting on." "Could be a trap," Ruby said, reloading with swift practice motions. Elias considered. Morrison was a politician, first killer, second. He'd want to minimize losses, especially if word got back to his backers in Denver. "I'm going out." "Like hell you are." Violet's voice carried surprising steel. He'll gun you down the moment you clear the door. Maybe, but if he wanted a massacre, he'd have brought twice as many men. Something else is driving this. Elias checked his weapons, making sure everything was loaded and ready. Keep me covered. The porch creaked under his boots as he stepped into moonlight, Winchester held loose but ready. Morrison waited 50 yards away, torchlight flickering across his face. Alone, but Elias could sense hidden guns in the darkness beyond. "You've got sand, I'll give you that," Morrison called. "Most men would have run after seeing my handiwork this morning. Most men don't cut down innocent women." Elias kept his voice level, watching for the telltale signs of an ambush. Horses shifting metal, glinting the subtle movements that meant death approaching. Morrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Innocent, those whores tried to destroy everything I built. Cost me a fortune in legal fees, scared off investors. They got what thieves deserve. I've seen your evidence, Morrison. Bills of sale for human beings, forged land grants, murdered witnesses. You're done." "Am I?" Morrison's hand drifted toward his gun. Jeremiah thought the same thing. Found him face down in his coffee, heart gave out from the strain. Terrible tragedy. Behind Elias, a board creaked. He spun Winchester, coming up as a shape emerged from the cabin shadow. But it was Violet, moving like smoke, something metallic gleaming in her hand. "Violet, get back inside." She ignored him, walking directly toward Morrison with deliberate steps. In her hand, a silver locket caught the torchlight. "Judge, do you recognize this?" Morrison's face went white. His carefully maintained composure cracked like ice in spring thaw. "Where did you get that?" "From your wife. Margaret Morrison, supposedly dead these 5 years. Except she's living in Denver under her maiden name, waiting for the right time to testify about your crimes." The revelation hit Morrison like a physical blow. He staggered, hand clutching his chest. "Margaret died in the river. I have the death certificate. Forged like everything else you've touched." Violet opened the locket, revealing a small photograph. "She kept this picture of your daughter, the one you told everyone drowned with her mother, little Sarah, alive and well in a Denver orphanage." Morrison's control shattered completely. "Lies, all lies." His gun cleared, leather muzzle swinging toward Violet. Elias moved on instinct, Winchester rising as Morrison's finger found the trigger. 2 shots crashed through the night air, echoes rolling across the valley like thunder. Morrison spun his bullet, going wide as Elias's round took him center mass. But Morrison didn't fall. Body armor under his coat, the impact staggering him, but not stopping the killing blow. His second shot lined up on Violet's heart. Ruby's Colt spoke from the cabin doorway, flame licking from the barrel. Morrison's head snapped back, black hat flying as her bullet found its mark. He collapsed like a felled tree, silver revolver tumbling from nerveless fingers. Silence descended over the valley, broken only by the crackle of dying torches and the distant sound of horses fleeing into darkness. Morrison's remaining men had seen enough. Without their leader, the fight went out of them like air from a punctured bladder. Violet knelt beside Morrison's body, checking for signs of life. Finding none, she retrieved a folded paper from his coat pocket. His confession. He was going to use it to bargain with the territorial governor, blame everything on subordinates who conveniently died tonight. Grace emerged from the cabin, Sadi close behind. The older woman surveyed the carnage with steady eyes. "It's finished, then." "This part is." Elias looked toward the ridge where scattered riders disappeared into pine forests. "But word will spread. Other men like Morrison will come looking to carve out their own kingdoms." Clarabelle stepped beside him, with her hand finding his arm. Blood streaked her face, but her eyes held something new. Hope, maybe, or the absence of fear. "Let them come. This valley belongs to people who will fight for what's right." The moon sailed overhead, casting silver light on a battlefield that had become a proving ground. They'd survived Morrison's justice, but the real test was just beginning. Dawn revealed the true cost of their victory. Morrison's body lay twisted in the frost, his face locked in the expression of a man who'd seen his empire crumble in a single night. But scattered around the cabin were signs that their troubles had only begun. Elias found fresh tracks leading away from the battle site. Not Morrison's fleeing men, but something else. Unshod horses, the kind ridden by Apache scouts. The explosion last night had drawn more attention than just local gunfighters. "We've got a company coming," he announced, stepping back into the cabin. The women were tending wounds, sorting through ammunition, trying to make the bullet-riddled structure defensible again. Different kind of problem. Ruby looked up from bandaging a gash on her arm. "Apaches. Maybe, or bounty hunters." Morrison had friends in territorial government men who won't appreciate losing their business partner. Elias checked his Winchester, counting the remaining rounds. 14 shots plus what the women carried. Not enough for another siege. Through the broken window, Sadi spotted movement on the northern ridge. Riders, lot of them. The approaching force moved with military precision, too organized for Indian raiders, too numerous for casual revenge seekers. As they drew closer, Elias made out blue uniforms beneath trail dust and worn leather. Cavalry patrol, or men disguised as such. Violet studied the approaching column through cracked shutters. Captain's insignia on the leader, but something's wrong with their formation. Real cavalry wouldn't bunch up like that in hostile territory. The riders spread out as they approached, surrounding the cabin with practiced ease. Their leader, a man wearing captain's bars on a stained uniform, rode forward under a white flag. His face bore the weathered look of frontier violence, eyes cold as winter stone. "I'm Captain Mills, Territorial Militia. You folks are under arrest for the murder of Judge Morrison and destruction of federal property." Elias stepped onto the porch, hands visible but ready to move. "Morrison was a criminal. We have evidence of his crimes." "Evidence?" Mills laughed, a sound like rattling bones. "You mean these forgeries?" He pulled out a familiar leather portfolio, Violet's careful documentation of Morrison's trafficking network. "Found them in the judge's possession. Clear proof you folks were trying to frame an honest lawman." The papers had been altered, Elias realized. Key pages removed, others changed to implicate the women rather than Morrison. Someone had been planning this contingency, preparing to rewrite the story if their puppet judge fell. Clarabelle stepped beside Elias, her voice cutting like sharpened steel. "You're not militia. Real cavalry wouldn't have gotten here this fast unless they were already nearby. You were watching, waiting to clean up Morrison's mess." Mills's facade cracked slightly. "Doesn't matter what you believe. Dead women tell no tales and live ones cause too much trouble." His hand rested on his saber hilt. "Judge Morrison was a valuable asset to certain interests. His death requires compensation." The circle tightened, horses snorting in the cold morning air. These weren't soldiers following orders, but hired killers wearing stolen uniforms. The territorial government's dirty work carried out by men who'd never see the inside of a courtroom. Grace appeared in the doorway, her old musket cradled in weathered arms. "Violet, did you keep copies of those documents?" "Hidden in town," Violet replied. "Safe place where certain people can find them if something happens to us." Mills heard the exchange, his face darkening. "Then we'll have to visit town next, clean up all the loose ends at once." Ruby's laugh held no humor. "You think killing us solves your problem? Word's already spreading. People know what Morrison was doing, know what you represent. Can't murder the truth. Watch me." Mills drew a saber, sunlight glinting off polished steel. Behind him, his men readied weapons, some carrying ropes, like the ones that had decorated the cabin gate that morning. But before Mills could give the order, new sounds echoed from the valley floor. Hoofbeats, many horses moving fast. A second column approached from the south, this one flying genuine military colors. Real cavalry, their uniforms, regulation clean weapons, regulation bright. Mills cursed, recognizing the threat to his operation. "Take them now, all of them." The fake militia charged, but they'd lost the advantage of surprise. Elias dropped behind the porch rail. Winchester speaking with rapid precision. His first shot took Mills from the saddle, the corrupt captain tumbling into the dirt with his saber still clutched in dead fingers. Ruby and Clarabelle fired from the cabin windows, their bullets finding targets in the confused mass of riders. Grace's musket boomed like thunder, her shot dropping a horse and rider in a tangle of screaming flesh and breaking bones. But there were too many attackers, and the women's ammunition was running low. Elias felt a bullet crease his ribs, spinning him against the cabin wall. Another round punched through his left shoulder, numbing his arm and making the Winchester suddenly heavy. Violet appeared beside him, pressing a spare revolver into his weakened hand. "Last stand," she said quietly. "At least we took Morrison with us." Sadi crouched behind the overturned table, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to reload her derringer. "I don't want to die like this, not after everything." But the real cavalry arrived like avenging angels, their charge scattering the fake militia across the meadow. Genuine soldiers following legitimate orders, cutting down criminals who'd stolen their uniforms in honor. The battle turned in moments, Mills's survivors fleeing into the forest with military pursuit close behind. A young lieutenant dismounted near the cabin, saluting despite the chaos around them. "Ma'am, sir, Lieutenant Crawford, Territorial Cavalry. We received word about irregular militia operating in this area. Grace emerged from the cabin dignity intact, despite the blood on her dress. From who? Denver Marshal got a telegraph 3 days ago. Anonymous tip about corruption in the territorial administration, naming specific individuals involved in human trafficking. Crawford looked at the women with obvious respect. Someone's been gathering evidence, building a case that reaches all the way to Washington. Violet smiled despite her exhaustion. Margaret Morrison. She's been working with federal investigators since she faked her death. Had to wait until Morrison was gone before she could surface safely. The lieutenant nodded. Mrs. Morrison's testimony is what sent us here. She said there might be survivors who could provide additional evidence. But as the immediate danger passed, Elias realized their victory came with a terrible cost. The cabin lay in ruins, walls shattered by gunfire, roof partially collapsed from the earlier explosion. Morrison's network had been broken, but their safe harbor was destroyed. Clarabelle took his uninjured hand, her fingers strong and warm. What now? Through the smoke and devastation, Elias saw something he'd never expected to find in this violent land. 5 women who'd faced death with courage, who'd stood beside him when retreat was the sensible choice. Family forged in fire and sealed with blood. Now we rebuild, he said simply, together. The territorial marshal arrived 2 days later, his badge bright against weather-beaten leather. Marshal Thompson examined the evidence Violet had preserved, listened to testimonies from all 5 women, and nodded with grim satisfaction. Morrison's network had reached deeper than anyone suspected, tentacles of corruption spreading through 3 territorial governments. Mrs. Morrison's testimony in Denver corroborates everything you've told me, Thompson said, closing his notebook. Federal prosecutors are preparing cases against 17 officials, including 2 territorial governors. Ruby sat on the cabin's repaired porch, her arms still in a sling from the final battle. What about the women Morrison sold, the ones already shipped east? Pinkerton agents are tracking them down following the paper trail Violet documented. It'll take time, but we'll bring them home. Thompson's voice carried the weight of promises he intended to keep. Your survival made this possible. Every woman we save owes you their freedom. Through the following weeks, the valley transformed. Word spread of the women who'd defeated Morrison's empire, drawing settlers who'd been afraid to claim land while corruption ruled. Families arrived with wagons full of hope, farmers and craftsmen seeking honest opportunity in country that had been cleansed by violence. Grace established herself as the area's unofficial leader, her stern wisdom settling disputes and organizing community efforts. She'd survived too much to be intimidated by frontier politics, and people naturally turned to her for guidance. Sadi found her calling, teaching the children of new settlers her gentle nature, healing young minds that had seen too much hardship. She built a small schoolhouse near the creek where reading lessons mixed with practical frontier skills. Ruby married a cavalry sergeant named Jackson, a man who'd fought in the final battle against Mills's fake militia. Their wedding was the valley's first celebration, marked by fiddle music and dancing that lasted until dawn. She kept her maiden name and her gun symbols of independence, earned through blood. Violet opened a law office in the growing town, helping settlers navigate legal complexities while continuing to document corruption wherever she found it. Her careful records had become legendary among federal prosecutors, her testimony feared by crooked officials across the territory. The cabin itself rose from its ruins stronger than before. Elias and Clarabelle worked side by side, raising walls with lumber donated by grateful neighbors. Each board carried the memory of violence survived, but also the promise of peace earned through courage. Different kind of building this time, Elias observed, fitting a window frame into place. His shoulder had healed clean, though cold weather still brought reminders of Mills's bullet. Clarabelle handed him the next piece of trim, her movements easy and sure. The rope marks on her throat had faded to thin white lines, scars that spoke of survival rather than defeat. Not just shelter anymore, home. They had married in the spring, with Grace performing the ceremony and the other women serving as witnesses. No fancy dress or formal vows, just 2 people who'd chosen each other through fire and bloodshed. The kind of bond that couldn't be broken by outside pressure. On summer evenings, they gathered on the new porch to watch sunset paint the mountains golden red. Children played in the yard where Morrison's men had once prepared for slaughter, their laughter replacing echoes of violence. You ever wonder what would have happened if you'd kept riding that morning? Clarabelle asked, her hand finding his, as darkness crept across the valley. Elias considered the question seriously. He'd inherited his uncle's land, expecting solitude, a place to forget the war and its aftermath. Instead, he had found something infinitely more valuable, purpose family, a reason to fight for something better than mere survival. Can't imagine it, he said honestly. This is where I was supposed to be. Through the open window, they could hear Grace reading to the younger children, her voice steady and warm as she brought fairy tales to life. Ruby's laughter carried from the kitchen, where she and Sadi prepared supper for the extended family that had grown around them. Violet's lamp burned late in her study, where she worked on legal briefs that would shape territorial law for generations. Her quiet dedication had become the foundation of justice in a region once ruled by corruption and fear. The valley had healed, but it bore scars that served as reminders. Morrison's grave sat unmarked in the town cemetery, his headstone bearing only dates and nothing about the empire he'd built on suffering. Mills and his fake militia lay in unmarked plots beyond the fence, forgotten men who'd served forgotten masters. But near the cabin, under spreading oak trees, 5 small markers remembered the women who'd hung from Morrison's gallows. Not their names, which remained unknown, but their sacrifice. They died so others might live free. Marshall's coming back next month. Clarabelle mentioned watching fireflies begin their evening dance. Says Washington wants to make this valley an official example of federal justice. Politicians, Elias said with mild disgust, turn everything into speeches and ceremonies. Maybe that's not so bad. Let other places know what's possible when people stand together against corruption. She leaned against his shoulder, solid and warm, could inspire others to fight back. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the plains. The railroad had reached their valley, bringing legitimate business and honest opportunity. The frontier was changing law, replacing violence as the primary means of settling disputes. But some truths remained constant. Evil men would always seek power over others, would always find ways to exploit the weak and vulnerable. The difference now was that people understood resistance was possible, that ordinary citizens could defeat organized corruption if they had the courage to act. Clarabelle, Elias said quietly. Yes, that morning when I found you all hanging from those ropes. You were awake, weren't you, playing dead while waiting for your chance? She smiled, the expression visible in starlight. Had to see what kind of man would cut us down, whether you'd help us or just leave us breathing while you rode away. And I knew the moment you caught me instead of letting me fall, told me everything I needed to know about who you were inside. Her fingers tightened on his. Still true after everything we've been through. Above them, stars emerged in the clear mountain air. The same stars that had watched Morrison's reign of terror, that had seen the valley soaked in blood and fear. Now they looked down on something different, a community built on mutual respect and shared sacrifice. The frontier would continue changing, bringing new challenges and new opportunities. But this place, this valley where 5 women had refused to die quietly, would stand as proof that courage could overcome corruption, that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they stood together against evil. In the cabin behind them, Grace's voice rose and fell, with ancient rhythms telling stories that would live longer than the tellers. And in those stories, future generations would learn the most important lesson the West had to teach, that home wasn't something you inherited or purchased, but something you built with your own hands and defended with your own blood. The last light faded from the mountains. Inside, lamplight glowed warm and steady, marking the end of one story and the beginning of countless others.